In this video, I'm going to break down why your podcast isn't growing, even though you're doing all the right things. And this image right here of the sad podcast, is going to make total and complete sense by the end of this video. So stick with me. So look, before that, my name is Anthony Ranieri. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListens.com, a company helping education-based podcasters, business owners, coaches, experts in their field turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm also the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generates around $10,000 of attributed sales. It's more about you, so I want to dive straight in. So look, growing a podcast for many people can be compared to planting a seed in a garden with infertile soil. What do I mean? You can give the plant all the water in the world, all the sunshine, and all the care in the world, but still, the plant doesn't want to grow. So why is that? And yes, on the surface, everything looks great, but underneath, if the soil isn't fertile, the tree won't grow. So most podcasters, to them, their water, their sunlight, for them, that's posting on social media. To them, that's creating short form clips. To them, that's experimental with potentially, hosting ads. To them, that's hosting amazing interviews. That's to them, they're providing insane value to their listeners, but still won't grow. You're being consistent, you're working hard, and you've been doing this, honestly, at this point, maybe for several months, if not years. But again, the show, for whatever reason, doesn't want to grow. So why is that? Why is it that on the surface, it seems like everything is going well, that's going right, that you're doing all the right things? But again, the issue is when you look underneath the foundations of what we've found in our experience is that most podcasters don't have fertile soil. They don't have the right foundations that are strong enough to actually encourage growth month after month. And I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that in just a moment. But why is that? And what are these foundational pieces that most podcasters are missing? Here's the thing. Most podcasters basically copy each other. We speak to podcasters every day and we have tons of clients who work with on a one-on-one basis. And when podcasters come to us just looking for different ways to kind of grow their shows, we often find that most people's strategy is essentially copying other people, seeing what other people in the industry are doing. Maybe you see Steve Bartlett, maybe you see Chris Williams, maybe you see other podcasters in your industry applying a particular strategy. So you decide, I'm going to follow them along and do the exact same thing. To me, that's kind of like monkey see, monkey do. That's not a rose, but I think what tends to actually happen in the podcasting spaces, a lot of podcasters aren't growing. A lot of shows just aren't growing. And then those shows who aren't growing look at other podcasters and see what they're doing to decide what their strategy for growth should be. But the podcasters they are looking at in order to decide what strategy for them to use, those podcasters themselves are also struggling to grow. So then it becomes this weird cycle where everyone's copying everyone, but everyone you're copying is struggling to grow, and the strategy that they're following isn't actually working. The second piece, lack of time to effectively test strategies. Most entrepreneurs of podcasts, you're busy. You have so many other different moving parts. While trying to run the podcast, while trying to keep consistent, while trying to maintain your already busy life, as well as running the show and growing, most people just don't have the time to figure out effective strategies to actually test if something is working or if something is not, because they just don't have the time. The third piece is the basics that are so often overlooked. That's the honest truth. Most people just hit the ground running with their podcast, not thinking about these foundational pieces, which I'm going to break down in just a moment, that are so key and vital if you want consistent growth, if you want your podcast to be a positive ROI show, a machine that drives more business for your business, that gets you the right attention and gets you in front of the right listeners. Overlooking the basics is something that's so easy to do because, again, it's the basic. We just kind of think that we've got it all on lock. You start your podcast, you're 3 months in, then you're a year in, then you're 2 years in, and you're now basically stuck in the nuts and bolts of running the podcast that you never go back to revisit these foundational pieces. And then the final piece, most growth and monetization strategies and advice that you see on the internet, online, on Google are absolutely terrible. They're trash. If you've tried it yourself, you've seen that they just don't work. And again, that's just kind of like one of those unfortunate things that most information out there about how to grow a podcast is pretty limited. It's so generic and it's not actual specific strategies that are proven to work. It's just more like be authentic, be consistent. Now, while those things are super important and you definitely should do that, that's just a given for any podcast. And it's not advice, it's not a strategy that you feel like, wow, I've hit a golden nugget here. So these are the main reasons why most people are following strategies on the surface, they're doing all the right things, but their shows aren't growing, is because they're copying other people or other podcasters in the space whose shows aren't growing. They lack the time to actually effectively test strategies, or you lack the time to effectively test strategies, but you let me know. I don't want to make any assumptions. The basics are often overlooked. I'm going to get into that in just a moment. And finally, most growth and monetization advice on the internet is absolutely trash. They're just terrible. They're generic, basic. They are terrible. And now, what are these foundational pieces that most podcasters are missing? You see, most podcasters, they don't have a USP, a unique selling point that makes their show different to everything else that is already out there. It's so hard to gain traction and stand out when you don't have the unique selling point. Look, I'll be honest with you, there's 87 million podcast episodes that have been published and more being published every single day in the thousands, right? Or in the tens of thousands. Yet most podcasters lack a unique selling point. Again, something that makes their show stand out from their competition. If you're a business owner, a coach, an expert in your field, you probably know this already. There's so many other people in your space trying to do the exact same thing. And most people are just unaware that the days of just starting a solo show, an interview-based show, without something uniquely different about their podcast and having listeners flood in, those days are long gone. You could do that maybe back in the day when, podcasts are relatively new, but everyone and their grandma and dog wants to have a podcast. Do have a bloody podcast. So for you right now is really thinking about, how do I position myself as something different in the market? How do I make my show different? How do I package in a different way? How do I make it more exciting? What's missing from my market, from my industry, from my space? And how can I fill that gap? An example I can use, one of our clients called Kian, and we applied a strategy for him, and his show was a history podcast. But he realized that most history shows were very long, drawn out. Boring is the wrong word, but super heavy on information and a bit dry. So for him, he made like a bit of a twist, a bit of a polarizing type of podcast about historical figures who had shady past. And he called it Dickheads of Histories. And his goal, his USP was, he would, in 10-minute bite-sized comedic fashion, break down iconic figures, and share their shady past, even though these people were put on a pedestal. And it'll be 10 minutes comedic bite. He'll make it hilarious with British humor. And he just went through those popular figures. And again, it's a bit more exciting. It's a bit different to most podcasts out there about history. That was his USP. There's a bunch of different ones that you could do. But for yourself, again, have a think, how can I position my show as something different to my market? What can I do that's totally different? It's not about being authentic, about being more of yourself. And all those stuffs are great. But really, what will make your show uniquely different, objectively speaking? The second piece is they don't have a demand-based content strategy that's able to attract, engage, and retain new listeners. What do I mean? A content strategy in this context is, what's your process, a specific process of picking out talking points, topics for your podcast. Topics that you and your guests will focus on. Topics that are trending and hot right now. Topics and you validated that are hot in your industry, that your listeners are actively searching for. Most people have a normal content strategy. They speak to their audience, they speak to some of their listeners, they maybe speak to some clients, and they have some ideas and just get a guest on and just interview the guest and hoping the podcast will grow. But they don't have an actual process of deciding what topics to cover on the show. YouTubers don't just guess what content they're going to create. They look at data. They have a data-driven approach. And this is what demand-based content strategy allows you to do. And most people, most podcasters, entrepreneurs of shows don't have a data-driven process. It's really just guesswork. So how can you start implementing some more data? Are there some YouTubers that you can look at who are in the same niche as you, where you can see their number of views, their popular videos, the topics that they cover? Are there articles that you can see the impressions and engagement? Are there Reddit threads that you can go into and have a look at what your audience is talking about? Are there, online forums that you can see which questions in your industry blows up the most? Are there LinkedIn posts that have completely taken off? Are there trending topics or newsworthy topics that's going on in the industry right now that's timely, that's relevant, that because it's timely and relevant, are breaking news in, let's say, the business space? Or if you're in personal development, is there a new hack or something that's trending, that's ongoing right now, where we can see, based on data, based on YouTube views, based on search volume on Google, based on, people's engagement on a Facebook post or Reddit thread, actually having ways to validate that this idea is going to work before you cover it on the podcast is so important, because you're no longer guessing. We have a proven process to pinpoint particular topics that your listeners are already actively searching for. Because guess what? When something's trending, when something's hot, there's so much search volume going in on Apple and Spotify. People are searching in those keywords, An example that I have is one of our, I went to this London show. There's like this conference in London last year with my business partner. And we spoke to these ladies and we said to them, hey, they're getting, I can't remember how many, they were getting like 70,000 monthly downloads. It could have been 70,000 or 300,000. Honestly, the specific numbers kind of like left my mind. I'm going to insert a clip in here of the actual video. But we asked them, hey, look, guys, you've grown to this exceptional point. You've monetized, you're doing amazing. Like, their podcast is called Self-Care Club. We asked them, like, how did you guys do it? How did you grow? What was your strategy? And what they said was, hey, look, we just knew that we needed to focus on demand, relevancy, creating relevant and timely content. Most podcasters completely miss that. And again, I'm going to play the clip, them kind of sharing their experience of what really helped them grow their show by, again, seeing these trends and creating relevant content. And most people, again, miss this foundational piece. And finally, they don't know how to rank the show higher on Apple and Spotify with podcast SEO. which makes it impossible for new listeners to organically find their shows on streaming platforms. Again, Apple and Spotify. And for those, if you're not aware, podcast SEO is a process of ranking your show high on Apple and Spotify specifically. We're not talking about websites, we're not talking about blogs. That's all about Google, and that's great, but it takes too long. It doesn't really help you attract listeners. You attract readers who read blogs. But podcast SEO helps you rank higher on Apple and Spotify. Those are the main platforms new listeners go to and search in specific keywords, search terms. So they want to find a podcast on business podcast, or a podcast about how to grow a podcast, or a podcast about reducing anxiety, how to reduce anxiety. When you're able to rank for those keywords, the search term people are searching on Apple and Spotify, it's so much easier for your listeners, new listeners who don't know you yet, to discover you. And guess what? These are high intent listeners who are searching and actively looking for your podcast on Apple and Spotify. But most entrepreneurs and with podcasts don't know this is an actual thing. Most experts have no idea you can actually rank your show higher on Apple and Spotify by optimizing your show for podcast SEO, search engine optimization. These are the foundational pieces. So look, you can be doing all the right things on the surface, but maybe your foundations aren't firm. Without the 3 points I've mentioned above, it becomes hard, if not impossible, to grow a show consistently month after month after month. Your USB allowed you to turn more strangers into listeners and keep them into your world because your show has something unique about it. You've got that unique twist, the big heads of history, breaking down, historical figures who were put on the pedestals and exposing their shady past. That's a hook. That's unique. That's different. That's one of a kind show, When you don't have a demand-based content strategy where you're looking at data and seeing what's trending and having a way to attract the listeners in because it's a hot and trending topic, a way to engage them with the content because you're talking about something they're actually interested in, and a way to retain them long-term because every single episode is specifically tailored to them, their needs, what they want. How are you going to grow month after month when you can't get those listeners coming back for more because you don't have a demand-based content strategy, because you're just hoping and guessing? And how are you going to be discovered and grow your show organically without constantly relying on social media, without constantly relying on guests who might, invite some of their audience into your own, but then the audience don't stick around, or you guess on other people's podcasts. But again, when you're not easy to discover, when someone types in a specific keyword, how are you going to be found organically? How are you going to break past slow and steady growth? Are you going to just constantly be reliant on the grunt work of social media and posting and targeting high-profile guests, which doesn't even help you grow? You're going to figure out a way to really make this work for yourself. That's what I really want to encourage you to do, because this is so fundamental. And again, it's the basics that are so easy to skip over. I truly believe that earlier that you as a podcaster, you as an entrepreneur can figure out why your podcast isn't growing, the quicker you can get to faster growth, a bigger audience, and a monetized podcast. I truly, in my heart of heart, believe that, right? Because if you don't know why your show isn't growing, again, you're just guessing. But once you can figure that out, the faster it is for you to grow your show. So don't give up because something isn't working. If it's not working, there's usually a reason why. So spend some time to figure that out. Maybe this video helps you see a few things that you might not be doing, and if not, nothing changes. If you don't take time to evaluate this, nothing changes. I don't want that. I know you don't want it yourself. I know you're working hard. I know you're doing all the right things. I know that's frustrating when you when you look at the dashboard and it's just stagnant or it's just growing just a little bit and you can't seem to have that breakthrough, that takeoff, even though you're creating incredible content. Trust me, I get that. It's frustrating, I know. And that's why I'm just not trying to give you all this BS of like what to do, this fancy strategy. That is the basic unsexy work that needs to be done in order to grow the show. This is just from my experience helping our clients growing our own show. This is what we see. So what should you do? Well, number one, focus on building a USP. We focus on differentiating yourself from other competitors out there. What can you do differently? If everyone's got like a long 1 hour long show, 2 hours, can you make yours 10 minutes? And maybe, they're doing a weekly show. Maybe can you make yours daily? I'm using arbitrary examples here, but really just thinking about how can you position yourself for something unique where someone discovers your podcast and think, wow, this is so different. Instead of just a normal podcast about business and interviews, how about you just like audit people's business? And that's like a quick 15-minute breakdown of someone's business, or instead of you just doing like a normal like personal development show, how about you share live coaching sessions that you have with clients? They're open to you sharing that. But whatever that looks like for you, make it unique, make it feel like an experience for your listeners, right? That's your hook. Build a demand-based content strategy, have a data-driven approach, look on YouTube, look on all these different platforms to figure out like what's trending right now in my industry. How can I hop on these trends, introduce myself to a new audience? And then how do I make sure that I keep coming back for more because I'm covering topics I know that they will love? topics that's going to nurture them, topics that means that I know what content is going to grab their attention, keep them in. And then eventually, if I want to monetize, I know I can easily monetize because my content is speaking to the right audience. I have that alignment that's there. And then finally, start optimizing your podcast for podcast SEO. It helps you become more discovered on Apple and Spotify. It helps you be seen by new listeners on a day-to-day basis. Stop guessing, have the foundations in place, and then you can add the water to your flower, right? You can get high-profile guests. And guess what? When their audience come, their audience stick around because you're covering because you're covering relevant and timely content. You know, when you guest on other people's podcasts and you share your show, guess what? People can easily find your podcast because it's optimized for podcast SEO. They become a listener because they see how unique your podcast is and it's presented something completely different. And they love it. They stay binging because you've got demand-based content strategy. When you collaborate with other shows, when you add sponsorship, when you sponsor other people's podcasts and have them shout out your podcast and they read out your tagline and a quick description of your show. A history podcast giving 10-minute bite-sized comedic fashion breakdowns, exposing your favorite historical figures' shady pasts. How much easier is it for someone who just discovered your podcast to hear that? How much more effective will advertising on other people's show be if you're sponsoring other people's podcasts and they read that to their audience of, let's say, 1,000 people? Because it's clear what your unique selling point is. It sells itself. That's an amazing pitch, you know. And when it comes to promoting on social media, when you have a USP, it's easy to convert eyeballs into listeners. When you have a USP and you're promoting on social media, people want to tune in, you know. And then when you get people who finally take that next step on social media and then discover your podcast and listen in, guess what? They're going to be hooked in. And guess what? Because you're now optimized for podcast SEO, when they go into Apple and Spotify, they can easily find you. These are the foundational pieces that you need to have in place before you think about growing your show. That's where most people mess up. They focus on exposure, and they skip over the basics. And again, I don't want that for you. So look, I hope this has gave you a lot more clarity, and I hope you can see kind of like what this image is all about. You're already working hard. So again, focus on the basics before we move on to anything else. I feel like I've said my piece here. And look, if you enjoy this, my name is Anthony Ranieri. You've been honestly fantastic. I really enjoy making these videos. If you liked it, if you enjoy these videos, if they gave you some ideas, leave a comment down below. And of course, if you're interested to find out more about what we do and how we help our clients grow, check out the first link in the description. It is a pitch. Just be honest with you. It's an absolute pitch where we kind of walk you through some case studies, our client results. The point is to get you on the call to see if we can actually help you on a one-on-one basis or in a group setting. So again, if that's something that interests you, check the first link down below. And if not, that's totally cool as well. Be sure to subscribe and binge our back content. We're creating the #1 education company for podcasters who are looking to grow and monetize their shows. And again, this is a program and this is what it's all about. So with that being said, peace.